This portion of CVI training for effective teaching of students with visual impairments is laying the CVI foundation, identifying children with CVI. I am Stephanie Steffer. At the completion of this session, each participant should be able to identify students that are at risk for possible CVI. Let us now remind ourselves how our vision is processed without any damage to the brain. First, light enters the eye and passes through the cornea and lens. The cornea and lens work together to project the inverted image on the retina. Information about the image is then transmitted along the optic nerve to the brain. The optic nerves from both eyes meet and cross at the optic chiasm at the base of the hypothalamus of the brain. The information now splits based on the visual fields. You can see here that the right visual field, demonstrated in blue, splits and goes to the left optic tract, or the left side of the brain, and the left visual field, shown here in red, is on the right optic tract, or the right side of the brain. As the message continues through the lateral geniculate nucleus, or LGN, in the thalamus of the brain, it then relays the visual image to the primary visual cortex. Your eyes and brain are doing so much work every time they see anything in your world around you. You may have seen or heard some of the things that you see on the slide here today, and we need to talk about them so that we can all be on the same page. Cortical blindness. I've seen this on multiple eye reports before, and it's very confusing, especially to families. It is my understanding that cortical blindness would mean a child is totally blind, no light perception, due to damage in the brain. This is not the same as a child with a cortical visual impairment. The next on the list is a degenerative eye condition. CVI is actually a condition in which vision can and should be expected to improve. The only time Dr. Roman cautions us that vision may not improve is if the student has a degenerative neurological condition preventing that progress. The next misunderstanding of cortical visual impairments is that a child's vision with CVI changes from minute to minute. Hopefully, after so much work done by researchers, this is no longer the perception of professionals in the field. We now know better that this is simply not true. How many different names have you heard or seen? Maybe it was in an eye report, maybe it was mentioned at a conference. Listed on this page, I have a few of the most common names that I hear when I'm doing my research. Neurological visual impairment, brain-based visual impairment, and probably the more common ones are cerebral visual impairment and cortical visual impairment. So which one is it? What are we going to call this? I've created this infographic to help explain my understanding. The umbrella represents the neurological visual impairment or the brain-based visual impairment terms. Those are the overarching terms. And underneath that umbrella, we have cerebral and cortical visual impairments. They are not the same. Researchers would agree that they are not synonymous with one another. They are, however, under the umbrella of neurological or brain-based visual impairments. You'll hear Gordon Dutton refer to things as cerebral visual impairment, and you'll hear Dr. Roman reference cortical visual impairment. According to Dr. Roman's 2018 second edition text, cerebral encompasses all forms of visual processing disorders, including those that have been associated with visual perception difficulties. Cortical visual impairment, on the other hand, is specific to the conditions that affect the part of the brain known as the posterior visual system. So when we look at this diagram, where is the posterior visual pathway? Where does the damage have to occur in order for it to be considered cortical visual impairment? This would include the lateral geniculate nucleus, the optic radiation, and the primary visual cortex. I found this image extremely helpful for me to visualize the impact of how an individual with CVI may see a target. In this case, the man in the picture is looking at a cup. But once it moves into the posterior visual pathway, the damage to the brain may not be able to make sense out of that image. We can use Dr. Roman's 3 elements to help us identify the cortical visual impairment under the large umbrella of brain-based visual impairments. The first is an eye exam that does not explain the individual's functional use of vision. When you examine a child's eye report, ask yourself, does this match what I'm hearing from teachers and family that know the child? Does this make sense for the behaviors I'm observing? A child with astigmatism or nystagmus should not appear clumsy or like they are avoiding to use their vision in a new location. I've had a parent hand me a healthy ocular report, but their child appeared to only look at things that had lights and movement. Times like this, your red flags should go up. Shown here are just a few eye conditions that Christine Roman Lancey has identified as possible associations with CVI. This is not an exhaustive list, and it does not mean that the diagnosis automatically equates to CVI. A child must demonstrate the other 3 elements as well. Simply, if you see these diagnoses in an eye report, all we're asking is that you be mindful during your evaluation process. The second element is a history of brain condition, trauma, or damage associated with CVI. Once again, I am sharing a list of conditions, but not an exhaustive list, that have been known to potentially cause CVI. On the far right, you will also notice I have listed cerebral palsy and prematurity. While these are not a cause, they have been associated with children that have cortical visual impairment. In 2013, Michigan Department of Education Low Incidence Outreach CVI team created this red flags document to share with the evaluation teams. This document was based from Dr. Roman's 2007 text and is available for download with this module's content. The third and final element is the presence of certain visual and behavioral characteristics. The 10 visual and behavioral characteristics of CVI are color preference, need for movement, visual latency, visual field preference, difficulty with visual complexity, need for light, difficulty with distance viewing, atypical visual reflexes, difficulty with visual novelty, and finally, the absence of a visually guided reach. The next video in our learning module will go over each of these characteristics in more detail. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions, please contact your CVI mentor.